Where an attribute, like colour for example, is accessible, there's no straightforward reason to assume that somebody must be using a heuristic to make judgments about it. Now, of course, you might be using a heuristic, for example, to make judgments about colour, but we can't assume that there must be some heuristic and just ask what heuristic it is, because the attribute is accessible. Now, let's suppose for a moment that moral attributes are accessible. In that case, again, we'll find that the idea that you need a heuristic is going to need much different justification from the case that would be if these moral attributes are somehow entirely inaccessible. Then some heuristic or other would be needed. So let's take a look now at the case for the claim that moral attributes are accessible. I'm going to start with an analogy here. So you and I are probably both capable of making unreflective linguistic judgments. So here are two things which might claim to be sentences of the English language. But you can probably judge that whereas one is a sentence, and indeed a true sentence, here's a waffling fatberg of lies, two, a waffling fatberg lies of is he, kind of sounds like it might be a piece of poetry, but it's not a sentence of English, right? I think most people. So we can make these judgments, we can make these fast, and we can make these spontaneous judgments. So we can ask the question, here we've manifested a linguistic ability, the ability to distinguish a grammatical sentence from a non-sentence. What is it that we compute that enables us to track these syntactic properties, properties such as sentencehood? And the standard answer is that we compute the syntactic attributes themselves. We compute the syntactic attributes themselves. But note here, this is not supposed to be because we can articulate truths about those syntactic attributes. Right? So probably most people have either no view or an incorrect view about the syntactic structure of this sentence. Unless you've done a course in linguistics, it's unlikely that you're going to be right about the structure of the sentence. The thought here is that you and I have a linguistic module. The module performs all kinds of computations in accordance with principles of syntax, and those computations result in us being able to distinguish the grammatical from the ungrammatical sentence. So this is, I think, an interesting point with respect to arguments for the inaccessibility of moral attributes, because it's hard to tell what the structure of a sentence is for you or me, right? I'm assuming that you haven't taken that course in linguistics. And it's hard to tell what it means for a sentence to be syntactic or not. Indeed, if you haven't taken a course in linguistics, then like me, you will have basically no idea. And if you don't believe me, take a course in linguistics. Actually, I'm lying. I did take a course in linguistics once, and I was struck by just this thought, right? What the course basically showed me is I really have no knowledge of syntax whatsoever. I kind of had the illusion that I might know some things about syntactic properties, but I didn't. Absolutely had no clue at all, despite having learnt, more than one language and so on, second languages, really hadn't worked out syntax at all. That was really a big eye-opener. Well, where are we here? I take it that reflection on the case of syntax shows it's possible for it both to be the case that it's hard for us to tell whether certain attributes apply, whether a sentence has these attributes or doesn't have them, and yet attributes from that family can nevertheless still be accessible. So I take this to be a problem. I take this to be a problem for the argument that we have just seen from Sinnott, Armstrong and colleagues for the inaccessibility of moral attributes. But I want to stop here. You see, there is, I think, a very futile kind of philosophy which simply considers, is there a conceivable objection to the view that you are developing? And the answer to that question in philosophy will almost always be yes. Deductive or decisive arguments in philosophy, decisive arguments, are extremely rare, and to find a decisive argument which actually has any sort of value is practically unheard of, right? Very hard. Try and think of a decisive argument in philosophy that has any value, compared to the number of pieces of philosophy that are valuable. I think you'll find those involving decisive arguments are a small fraction of a larger whole. So that we have found an objection in principle by itself, I'm not very excited about that, right? It was kind of guaranteed that we were going to do that already. What's more interesting, I think, is whether or not there's a interesting view behind the line of objection. Right? So if there's no interesting view behind the line of objection, then I would say let's go ahead and take the Sinnott, Armstrong and colleagues' effecturistic view, because that's really the only interesting way of thinking about these ethical abilities. But if there's an alternative, fruitful, interesting way of thinking about ethical abilities, now I'm much more interested in the objection, because then the objection allows me to keep track of which of these different views I'm going to prefer. So that's really what I'm interested in here. Is there a coherent, interesting, fruitful alternative to the effecturistic view that's motivated by the objection from syntax? Well, in the case of language, we might think that linguistic competence involves a special purpose module, which operates according to linguistic rules. Now you notice here that I'm not telling you what a module is. I'm not telling you what a module is, and that's quite deliberate. There's a little bit about it in the notes below. That's something you can follow up if you want to. But for our purposes, we're just going to think that a module is a cognitive system which is relatively encapsulated, so its operations are separate from other cognitive operations and subject to it's domain specific and subject to limited accessibility. So what's going on in the module is not something that you're likely to be able to say very much about if I ask you about it. Now that's very, very crude. There's much more to think about modularity if you'd like to, but equally it's not essential for now. Right? I think we can work with a very loose idea about what we're talking about for now. All right, so there's a very standard picture about language, which is actually moderately difficult to understand. Right? This is just a very crude introduction. And Mikhail is one of several people who've developed a counterpart for ethics. So Mikhail defends a view on which, as he puts it in this earlier, shorter paper, the mind contains a moral grammar, a complex and possibly domain-specific set of rules. This system enables individuals to determine the deontic status of an infinite variety of acts and omissions. Marvellous. So this is Mikhail's view. Now, he doesn't use the term module. He's far too careful for that. What he wants to establish, in effect, is that what goes in the case of linguistics goes in the case of ethics. And he doesn't want to get into debates about whether the linguistic case is best captured by one or another kind of modularity or by something else. That's very sensible of him. I'm going to go with module. I'm going to make this cruder and simpler and just think about module all the way through. Linguistic module, ethical module. We don't lose much by that because we're not getting into those broader debates. Good. All right. So this is Mikhail's view. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because that view of Mikhail, it's sometimes referred to as the linguistic analogy, underpins the objection to the claim that moral attributes are inaccessible. On this view, moral attributes are accessible, even though we couldn't say very much about them. Now, the thing to note here is that although I'm calling Mikhail's view the linguistic analogy, that's not strictly right. I should really call it a linguistic analogy. And that's because there are a bunch of theorists who have offered linguistic analogies, but as you can see from a reference in the notes, they've actually pulled in quite different ways. So there are a variety of actually quite distinct views which go under the heading the linguistic analogy, and we probably shouldn't mumble them together. So I'm really talking about Mikhail's view, and this is Mikhail's view, the view that there is something analogous to a syntax module for ethics, a kind of ethics module. Now, okay, interesting question. If that's a linguistic analogy, if that's Mikhail's view, what evidence might indicate that humans do have such a module? What might show us that Mikhail's view is true? And before I tell you what I think about this, or at least some of what I think about this, it's over to you. What evidence might indicate that humans have an ethics module as Mikhail claims? So with your lecture buddy or lecture buddies, 90 seconds, go. All right, so that's a hard question for many people. Some people may have come across this kind of question before, but very difficult question. I think as far as the available literature goes, there are three main arguments that we can and probably will consider. One is due to Dwyer and is based on a phenomenon called dumbfounding, which I think would be quite important for us to look at carefully, probably next week in the lectures. Another phenomenon is resistance to revisability. And the third one is the idea that there is structure implicit in moral intuitions. Steve, what are these ideas? Do you know what? I want to keep things moving here, so I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to focus on the third one. I think this is actually the strongest argument, whereas the others, well, you'll see what I think about those later. So I'm going to take the strongest argument for now, and the most interesting one. And this is an argument which is most fully developed in this 2014 paper by Mikhail that's also cited in the lecture notes that you'll see below this recording. So what's the argument here? What's the idea about structure implicit in moral intuitions? Very important idea for us on this course. Well, it goes like this. Adequately specifying the kinds of harm that humans intuitively grasp requires, says Mikhail, a technical legal vocabulary. So that's the premise. And that leads to a conclusion. And the conclusion is that the abilities underpinning unreflective judgments must therefore involve analysis in accordance with rules. And then we can quickly get from this to, and you'll see in the notes below how that might go, to the claim about modularity. Right? I think that's fairly straightforward. Okay, good. So the really interesting thing for us is then try to establish the premise, and that's indeed the focus of Mikhail's efforts. How do we show that adequately specifying the kinds of harms that humans intuitively grasp requires a technical legal vocabulary? The idea here, of course, is not that the humans themselves have facility with the technical legal vocabulary. Clearly they don't. The idea here is rather that technical legal vocabulary is needed to talk about the patterns in the human's moral intuitions. Well, why would that be? Mikhail looks at a famous contrast due to, or broadly speaking, due to the philosopher Philippa Foot. So it's Philippa Foot who got us into all of this a long time ago. So here's one dilemma. He's going to offer us a pair of dilemmas. And actually this dilemma, it's much easier if I show you. I'm going to show you this dilemma. Here it is. Let's see if this works for you. So here's the trolley problem in action.
My whole life.
It's just that it's so theoretical, you know? I mean, maybe there's a more concrete approach. Here, let's try this.
Oh, God! Michael, what did you do?
I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Make a choice.
The thing is, ethically speaking...
No time, dude! Make a decision!
Well, it's tricky. On the one hand, if you ascribe to a purely utilitarian worldview...
All right, so you get the idea. There's the trolley problem from The Good Place. Very important source. If you haven't studied ethics before, do watch The Good Place. That's where you get your ethics from, I guess. And so you ask the question, is it okay to hit the switch? Now, if we do this as a study, what we'll find is that many humans will say yes. Not all of them, but will, generally speaking, in most samples, there is some interesting cultural variation. We'll come back to that later in the course. But pretty much, you're going to find very consistently that humans will say, yes, it's okay to hit the switch. Not everybody, but many people. Now think about a different dilemma. This is a dilemma which is supposed to be quite similar, but it changes things around a bit. So now you've got 5 people who are going to die, and you can save them by cutting up one healthy person and distributing her organs. Is it okay to cut her up? And again, there's some variation here, but you're going to find that on the whole, people say no. It's not okay to cut her up. Now, what's really interesting, though, is this. There are people, many people, it's not a minor thing, it may not be everybody, but there are many people where if you give them this dilemma first, they are disposed to say yes. But if you give them this dilemma first, they are disposed to say no. So it seems that they are committed to what looks on the face of it to be an incompatible pair of views. Right, this is what Philippa Foot noted. There seem to be pairs of dilemmas like this where, from an ethical point of view, they're sort of indistinguishable. They ought to be indistinguishable. Certainly if you're most kinds of consequentialist, these ought to be indistinguishable to you. And yet people will give different answers, suggesting to many people that there's some kind of inconsistency in their thinking. But what does Mikhail say? Right? So the question, of course, here is, why do people respond differently? Right? Why do they do that? And that seems pressing if you think that that pattern of answers is or appears to be inconsistent. Right? What could explain that pattern of answering? Mikhail suggests, actually, it's because the dilemmas are constructed in such a way that there is a relevant ethical difference. One involves what is legally characterized as purposive battery, and the other does not, right? So that's to say harming somebody's body deliberately. Why does Mikhail think that? Well, he gives us a analysis of the structure of what's happening in two cases. And the way you read his diagrams, you start from the bottom and you work up, right? So what's happening in the trolley case is that I'm pushing the button, that's causing the tram to turn, and that's preventing the train from killing the person, right? And that's, of course, all the bit that I intend. But there are now some side effects, and one of the side effects is battery. That's to say that that one worker, assuming I do pull the switch, that one worker is battered by me. But the important thing is that from a legal point of view, that's not purposive. That's not purposive. It may be foreseen and foreseeable, but it's a side effect, so it doesn't count from a legal point of view as purposive battery. Now look what happens in the transplant case. I cut up a healthy patient. That's actually the first thing I do in the transplant case. And in cutting up that healthy person, I am committing battery. Right? So from a legal point of view, this is now purposive battery. Mikhail says, you know what? It looks to you, the philosopher, as if these two cases are not ethically different. But that's an illusion. You're just somehow too caught up in your consequentialist view, or you just haven't thought about the cases clearly enough. If you think about them from a deeper point of view, if you think about their structure, you see that the two actions have quite different structures. And that difference has legal consequences, where the legal code captures an important ethical difference. So there is, after all, an important ethical difference between these cases. Now, it's not just these two cases. If it was just those two cases, none of us, I think, would be very impressed. But here's a table which you probably can't see here. You're going to have to go and read Mikhail to take a proper look at the table if you're interested. What Mikhail says, look, there are many, many cases where his structural analysis approach can work. That's to say, it looks, if you consider the dilemmas quite superficially, as if humans are often providing inconsistent responses. But actually, when you think carefully about the causal structure of the two parts of the dilemma, you see that their answers are not inconsistent at all. On the contrary, they are consistent with quite sensitive, careful moral principles, and his emphasis is on the principle of purposive battery. You should always avoid purposive battery. So that's Mikhail's argument. The contrasts that appear to be inconsistent make sense from a legal point of view, so there's no need to suppose that there are incompatible ethical principles, and so no problem. It follows from this, of course, that our moral intuitions seem to correspond to legal distinctions. And that was the very premise that Mikhail wanted for his argument for the existence of an ethics module. This isn't the full argument here. You can see a slightly fuller argument in the notes, but this gives us the core of the argument. And it's that first premise that's really hard to establish. If we give Mikhail that, I think everything else will follow. Nice. Okay, good. So here's an interesting argument. Humans' ethical abilities involve a moral module, and that moral module is what's responsible for the pattern of judgments that humans will make when we try to test their moral intuitions in various famous ethical dilemmas. Brilliant. Okay, very good. So humans have an ethical module. Now, you might be unimpressed by that argument. You might be saying, Steve, that's a terrible argument. And that could be because I haven't represented Mikhail's argument very well, or it could be because there's some problem with Mikhail's argument that you've identified. Those are good things. Well, the second is a good thing. The former obviously isn't. Even if you think that, though, even if you think that there's some problem with Mikhail's argument, I do want to stress that we still get something out of this. And this is that Mikhail leaves us with a puzzle. We need to explain why it is that patterns in humans' intuitive judgments reflect legal principles they're unaware of. His conjecture, that I'm putting in terms of a moral module, would explain that. Right? These patterns exist because humans' ethical abilities are based on a module, and those legal principles reflect what's encoded in that moral module in the same way that the principles that linguists have formulated reflect principles encoded in a linguistic module. That would be one way of solving the puzzle. If you reject that, you don't think these arguments are compelling, then you need an alternative answer to this question. And for me, on this course, the most valuable thing is not actually the conclusions, but the puzzles. Right? I'm not really the philosopher who has to come up with a view on this course. That's your job. Right? Your job is to work out the truth here. My job essentially is to tell you something about the puzzles that you can find that are going to constrain which views are acceptable. So this is very important to me. Much more important than whether or not we accept or reject Mikhail is whether or not we think we have a good puzzle here. And we do. That's what I'm really going to stand by. 100%. There is a good puzzle here. All right. So why is any of this relevant? Well, I'm suggesting that the existence of structure, implicit in the way that humans respond to ethical dilemmas, so implicit in their moral intuitions for short, provides us with an argument that humans have an ethics module or a moral module. But why is that relevant to us? Well, I wanted to know what it is that humans compute that allows their moral intuitions to track moral attributes. And if we accept that the ethics case is like the linguistic case, as involving a module, then the answer is that the humans are computing moral attributes. The humans are computing moral attributes. That's what the module is doing for them. And it follows from that, of course, that the moral attributes are not inaccessible after all. And that would seem to support an entirely different view of moral intuitions, one that doesn't involve the effect heuristic at all. So I set out to offer you an argument for the claim that moral attributes are accessible. I started off by giving you an objection to the argument for the view that they're inaccessible, and I then presented an argument for the view that I associate with Mikhail, the view that there is a moral module. And I think that if there is a moral module, then it's very likely that moral attributes are accessible. Or if they're not accessible, at least they're inaccessible in a way that does nothing at all to support arguments for the hypothesis that the effect heuristic explains moral intuitions. But have we shown that moral attributes are accessible? Have I succeeded in showing that? I don't think I have. Right? I don't think I have. I don't think the arguments considered so far are sufficient by themselves to justify accepting this conclusion. So what I want to suggest is that I've given you the first hint in the direction of arguments that might eventually lead us to that conclusion, or more carefully might lead you to that conclusion if you follow up and develop these arguments. But we're far from having reached that conclusion so far. What we can say is that there certainly seems to be a difficult and demanding issue about whether or not moral attributes are accessible. That's far from the simple issue that it first appeared to be.